am from a company called Barron Associates. We are a local Charlottesville engineering firm, and we specialize in the development of sensors and acquiring data in a variety of domains, and then using that data to solve problems. And so I'll be talking about a project that I did for monitoring energy expenditure in amputee patients. So I'm guessing that most of you in the room are familiar with devices like these. These are a lot of the consumer products that have really exploded in popularity recently for doing this problem of monitoring energy expenditure. And I'm guessing a lot of you might even be wearing them right now. So a lot of these devices, they're very popular now. But the thing is that energy expenditure is actually a really complicated problem to look at. So when you look at devices like these that are easily available on the market, on the one hand you have a lot of the ones that are really simplistic. So they're using simply inertial-based sensors to do things like step counting. And so that's like your Fitbit that just gives you how many steps you took in a day. And a lot of them will try to correlate that to energy expenditure as well. But there are a lot of cases where those fall short. So you can think of plenty of examples for those, especially as a lot of them are moving into wrist-worn devices like the ones shown up here. So if you're doing a workout like riding a bike or jogging while pushing a stroller, for example, those are tough workouts. But if your wrist is completely still, it's not going to detect your level of activity within any kind of close accuracy. So to improve our accuracy, we need more information. And recently, a lot of these sensors, a lot of these devices have started including heart rate sensors as well. And that will give you a lot more information. Just physiologically, heart rate increases linearly as oxygen uptake increases up to a certain level. So that's very useful information to have when you're predicting energy expenditure. But it's still a complex problem. In the extremes, it doesn't perform super well. And then devices like these, they're looking at averages to give your average user an idea of what their energy expenditure level is. But that's still going to leave some people out. So my project was looking at some of those specific cases, in particular, individuals who have lost a lower limb. So this research was actually funded by the Army. They were interested in this problem. As you can imagine, if you lose a lower limb, your metabolic demands are greatly increased. It's a lot harder to get around and do the same kind of activities if you're trying to do it with a prosthetic limb as opposed to your own limb. And there's a couple numbers here. If you have a transtibial amputation, so that's below the knee, you can see up to a 25% increase in your metabolic demand. And for transfemoral, which is above the knee, that can be up to 70%. So if you give an individual like this a Fitbit, it's not going to come anywhere near being accurate for identifying their level of energy expenditure. And this is important for things like prosthetic technologies, which are attempting to improve their efficiency so that they can overcome this issue of the increase in metabolic demands. That makes it really hard for these people to get back into their activities of daily living and get back to their normal lifestyle. And these technologies are improving, but they're still not anywhere close to reproducing your own natural limb. And on this last point, I say no prosthetic device, but that actually applies also to the consumer devices. None of these take into account the specific demands that are required for people who've lost a limb. So that's where our project goal was to come up with a convenient monitor for energy expenditure. And we developed a system that's called the LimTech system. And so for our strategy, we start with the sensors, and that's getting to the sensors, a lot of the sensors that I talked about, so inertial sensing, that's tracking, it's like accelerometers, like tracking activity, tracking step count. heart rate sensors, since those are very useful. We have skin temperature as well. That's another useful signal. One of the specific problems here was putting it into prosthetic components themselves just to make it easy for the user to wear. That's something that the Army was really interested in. Then, once we have that, we can pull a bunch of data from those sensors, and we had to put those into smart algorithms. So we had to do signal processing to get things like stride length, step count out of the accelerometry data. And then we use polynomial artificial neural network models to do the actual energy expenditure predictions. And importantly, we want these all to be tuned to amputee patients. So that meant that we used our system to get data from a number of amputee patients. And at the same time, we had a truth measure, which is indirect calorimetry. That's a lab-based method where an individual wears a mask and has a backpack, and that's measuring the exchange of their oxygen and carbon dioxide. And that's a very accurate way to get energy expenditure. It's something that's done in the lab. It's not ever going to be used on normal people because you don't want to be wearing a mask everywhere. So that's where we that's how we obtain our data to put into these models so that they are very specific to this group of subjects who normal methods won't apply to. So this is some of the hardware details, which I'm just going to jump over really quick. So for the heart rate, we used photoplasmography, which is optical sensing. And if you have a Fitbit that has a heart rate monitor, you've probably seen those little green lights. So that's what that is. It's just tracking blood exchange to the capillaries. So we have a number of those that are embedded into the gel liners that amputee patients wear underneath their socket. So it's a soft, cushiony kind of gel thing that's like a sock for comfort. We partnered with a company called Willowwood, which is different from Willow Tree. Willowwood is based in Columbus, Ohio, and they make these gel liners along with a number of other prosthetic parts. So they embedded our sensors into their liner, and we have the hardware to do all of the data collection, wireless data transmission to an app. So then once we had our system ready, we implemented it with a number of amputee patients. And we used 2 sites of testing. We worked with the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago and also Arizona State University. At each site, we had 15 amputee patients use our system along with indirect calorimetry system. And they went through a number of exercise routines. And from those, we were able to then collect enough data so that we could create our models. So the specific activities that they were doing, so we wanted our models to be really robust and be able to account for the variety of activities that an individual will be doing from their day-to-day. So we first had them do a set of structured exercises in which they would do these items that were listed on the left, and at 6 minutes of each, they would just go sequentially through and do sitting, walking at different speeds, jogging if they were able to. So notably, our sensors are in the leg, since they're part of the prosthetic components themselves. So that sort of has the opposite problem of the wrist-worn devices. So we wanted to include upper body exercises as well, because you can imagine if you're standing doing a weight routine, your legs are still, that's not going to pick up on that activity. So we wanted to make sure that our models were robust enough to account for those cases as well. And then we also had them do simulated free living activities. So that was just a 30-minute data collection session where they were going from a variety of activities like sitting and typing, sweeping, doing some box loading, unloading for that upper body. And they just went from one task to another because we wanted to see how well we would also track the transitions between all of those activities. And then what we ended up doing with our model, we used the structured exercise activities as the training data, and then we validated on the free living activities. So the first step in the model synthesis is to identify the criteria, the variables that get put into it. So we had actually a lot more than what's listed here. So these are things like sex and weight as height. Those are metrics that are associated with energy expenditure, and then as well as all the data from our sensors. And from that, we extracted a number of features like activity counts, like stride length, stride interval timing. And so we had a large number of variables that we could select from. And we used a custom software to generate the model. And it identified the most important of those metrics and then constructed the model from there. And some results. So this is a representative subject. So on the top we have treadmill walking, on the bottom we have ground walking. And the blue line is the truth data, the COSMED is the lab system, and the red line is the model. So you can see that our model did fairly well in this case. And group data. So these are Bland-Altman agreement plots. So on the y-axis, we had the discrepancy between our model predictions and the calorimetry system, and that's plotted against the calorimetry system on the x-axis. The lines that are shown are the typical bands of an acceptable agreement. And then we also had these split up into the different training sites because we wanted to see if we collect all the data from one set of patients, how well does that translate to a completely new set of patients. So we used these different combinations of training the data with the Chicago subjects and then training with the Arizona subjects and then also validating on each one. So you can see that the majority of the data falls within the limits of agreement, which is good. There is, however, this tail that comes out as you get into the higher energy expenditure levels, where it's not performing as well. And so if we talk about explainability a little bit, we can look at our sensor data and see what's going on. So these are example data from the sensor. So on the top plot, we have an accelerometer. The middle plot is heart rate that you're getting from our optical sensors in our unit. The bottom is a reference ECG trace to give you an idea of how our heart rate is comparing. You can see from the top accelerometry plot that this patient was just sitting because it's very still. And so our heart rate's doing okay there. As soon as they start moving, it gets a lot messier. So that's obviously a problem. That's where we're seeing the model accuracy is not as great when we get into the higher levels of energy expenditure. So as they're doing more and more activity, we're not doing quite as well. And that turned out to be a pretty complicated problem, just giving all of the motion artifact that we got in our data from having the sensors embedded as part of the prosthetic device. And I won't get into this too much. But this is still a work in progress, but we're looking at some different techniques in the frequency domain. So how can we get our heart rate data cleaned up? And basically after implementing that, we did much better. This is an example of data that was collected just during running, and the heart rate increases over time, as you can see in that previous one. With the noisy data, it's doing not great. And then after we implemented some post-processing, we were able to get decent data. So we're still working on that. But I just acknowledge my colleagues and the Army for the opportunity to do this research, and thank you all for your attention here.